PCCEP. She, her pronouns. Thank you all for being here. Zainab, do you want to go?
My name is Zainab Folk. I actually a member as well as PCCEP, and my pronouns are she, her. Thank you.
And Vadim?
Hello, everybody. Good to see everybody online. My name is Vadim Azursky. I'm a member of PCCEP and chair of the Settlement and Policy Agreements Subcommittee.
Let's see. How about, sorry, I can't see the screen.
We have like.
How about other introductions?
Sure, I'll take it from here. Amy Anderson, I am chair of the Behavioral Health Subcommittee. Welcome everyone tonight. Thank you.
Any other PCCEP members that are here this evening?
I don't see any other PCCEP members. I do want to acknowledge we have Heidi Brown, as well as I believe Heidi will be presenting on behalf of the city, and Anika is here as well on behalf of the city. We have, it looks like Jared Hager on behalf of the Justice Department and Jonas Geisler as well. Jason Renaud on behalf of the Mental Health Alliance, in case people are just listening in and not reading who is the participants. We have the auditor here as well, the city auditor, Marihel Caballero, as well as Ross Caldwell as director of IPR, Tom Christoph as COCOL, and or on behalf of the COCOL. And I believe we have Sam Adams here on behalf of the city as well in the mayor's office. We have the Albina Ministerial Alliance, and on behalf of them, I believe we have Ashley Albies as well as Dr. Leroy Haynes, who may or may not be present at this point, but will be. Is there anybody else I'm missing here that is going to be presenting today on any of these topics? So feel free to speak up or put it in the chat and we'll name you as well. We have a full house. So, Anne, how do you feel about?
Yeah, I'm in a Zoom meeting. So the last question, it was like, what do you mean we do less than $0?
Someone is speaking, needs to be muted. Thank you.
Okay, I think we do.
I just muted also. You'll have to unmute yourselves as you see fit.
Thanks, Theo. Appreciate that. And so if everyone can, did we go through the rules or the rules of engagement, Theo? I didn't know if you already covered that already.
No, I just said hello to everyone. I wanted to mention that it's important to mention that this meeting will be recorded. If you need to change your name for any reason, I'd be happy to help with that. But we understand the need for anonymity. But please use respectful language when engaging with other folks. Be respectful of each other. Try to use I statements when applicable, and understand that we're all here for the reason of achieving equitable policing that exceed constitutional requirements. And we have our wonderful PCCEP volunteers here. So please let me know if you need anything. My name is Theo Lada. Please message me in the chat. We're gonna keep the chat relatively clear of questions. You'll all have time for questions, and just use the raise hand function and we'll call on you when you need to. Other than that, I look forward to this rich discussion. Thanks for being here.
I wanted to interject that we also have Meredith Mathis here for MHA. So thank you for being here as well. Go ahead, Zainab.
Thank you, and thank you, Theo. Thank you, Anne. So what we're going to do is first start off with the goal of the Settlement Agreement and Policy Subcommittee, so that everyone is aware. It is to ensure that the Portland Committee on Community Engaged Policing remains engaged with the objectives of the Department of Justice Settlement Agreement and handle any related business. The objectives include, but are not limited to, reviewing the annual Portland Police Bureau report, facilitating engagement with government partners, ensuring PCCEP meets regularly with necessary partners in the public community, and to monitor the Portland Police Bureau's ultimately their meetings, all necessary requirements of the settlement agreement. And so as we engage today, we're going to hear from the Department of Justice, the City of Portland, as well as the community. And those who are facilitating this meeting today is Ann Campbell, Vadim Lazarski, as well as Zainab Folk with the Settlement Agreement and Policy Subcommittee. Thank you. If you're considering joining the Settlement Agreement and Policy Subcommittee, contact the project director, Theo Latta. He can be reached at 503-865-6077, or you can also reach Theo at email theo.latta@portlandoregon.gov. Welcome again. And we've done our introductions, and we're planning on hearing from the Portland Police Bureau about their response to the Department of Justice. Is anyone here to speak on behalf of the Portland Police Bureau?
Yes, actually, can I jump in here? We're going to have Heidi Brown speak from the City of Portland. Is that correct, Heidi? Are you here on behalf of the city?
Yes, Anne, yes. I'm with the City Attorney's Office, and I am here speaking on behalf of the entire city, not the Portland Police Bureau only.
Well, thank you. And please go ahead.
Great. Well, thank you all. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. I appreciate the work of the PCCEP and all the time that all of you put into the PCCEP. I know your time is important and these issues are important. So I just want to first off acknowledge that in each of you and the time that you put in. So I want to just briefly kind of go over our report. It's or our response rather. As all of you know, it's long. There were a lot of issues to respond to from the Department of Justice annual report and then a March 23rd letter as well. So I'm going to try to touch on some of the highlights in our response. And then I'm happy to answer questions. And if I believe I saw a link that Theo put to the city's response, if somebody has not seen that yet, you're of course welcome to see that and just click on the link. In the response, I think it's important to acknowledge that first off, the city is very committed to the issues around police accountability and safety of the community and the relationship between those two. And that city council and the city in general has found it important to work with the Department of Justice. I think there have been a lot of changes that were critical that occurred during this time, and it's unfortunate that we are where we are today. For those of you who aren't aware, the process occurs when the Department of Justice or the city, either side, can notify the other that they feel that the other side is not in or is out of compliance with the requirements of the settlement agreement. They can notify the other party, and the other party has 30 days to respond to the specific areas of concern raised by the other. So the Department of Justice sent the City of Portland a letter via email on April 2nd. And the parties agreed that our response would be provided on, on May 7th, which is what we did and what we're here to talk about today. And just in case anybody's curious, if we don't resolve things via just our letter, the next step is for the Department of Justice and the city to meet and discuss the issues together informally. If that doesn't resolve issues, we would then go to mediation, a formal mediation. And if that still didn't resolve issues, then either party could file a motion with the court to return to the court and have the court address it. I do want to again acknowledge that the importance to the city of the work that's happened and happening under the settlement agreement. And as is here shown, there are 7 areas of the settlement agreement, broad areas, under which there are subsets. And there were 4 areas that the Department of Justice found the city out on. They were use of force, training, officer accountability, and community engagement. And so in the letter, we responded to those issues. I will note that, as I'm sure people have seen in the headlines, so I want to kind of acknowledge this, that the city did raise in our response our concern that the federal government's actions during last summer occurred at a time when the protests were quieting down, and that with some of the severe incidents that happened, people getting picked up in unmarked vans, the significant brain injury that occurred to Mr. Labella, that those really created a great deal of expansion in the concerns by community members in Portland, and escalated a situation that was already a challenging situation. And so I want to acknowledge that that's another piece that we raised in our response, was that made a situation that was already challenging. We felt it made it a lot worse and escalated things. That being said, we did acknowledge in our response areas under the use of force. In particular, there were concerns with the timing. The use of force section, a lot of it talks about incorporating, principles into the city's use, or the Bureau's use of force policies. Those principles have been incorporated and get updated annually. But within that use of force policy, there are timeline requirements that have to occur when there is a use of force event, and requirements for the reporting on the use of force that have to be met. And those were not met. The city acknowledged early on to the Department of Justice, I think in June, that we were not meeting the timelines for the after action reports, which the process is that within 72 hours, a sergeant needs to go and analyze the use of force, and that was not occurring timely. We also acknowledged in our response that not only were the responses not timely, but in addition, there were after actions analyses that were not critical in nature and not in depth enough. So there were times when there were sergeants reviewing uses of force reports a while after the use of force occurred, so that it really doesn't leave a sergeant in a position to adequately analyze that use of force. So we acknowledged that that was a problem that needed to be resolved. As well as there were some specific concerns with particular uses of force. And those were addressed more under the officer accountability, because that I think is more the process to address those. So within that, we also included, the city included acknowledging the areas where we agreed that we were not in substantial compliance under the requirements, and the ways in which the city intends to remediate those issues. And part of it was in response to the Department of Justice on page 4 of their annual report, gave 5 things that they felt specifically PPB should do. And so we went through those and looked at how could we do those. So in terms of more quickly analyzing use of force events in chaotic crowd control situations, such as what occurred last year. And I don't know if it was so much the chaoticness of the crowd control situation, but rather the fact that the protests and then uses of force and incidents of violence occurred over such a long period of time that there wasn't sufficient staff to analyze the uses of force events as should have occurred. And so one of the things that council just was voting on today were some amendments that are summarized amendments to the city's budget, and we'll be notifying the Department of Justice of those specifics. But some areas were to ensure that everybody at the city, at the police bureau received crowd control training that will be starting in June. That there was specific training on analyzing uses of force, because one of the concerns that the Department of Justice raised was that as I said earlier, that the criticism of the use of force was insufficient, and there were concerns about that all the way up through the command level. And so there was a training done recently to ensure that everybody in the command level understands the requirements and understands some of the rulings that came out of the restraining order with Judge Hernandez, and the policy and how the policy should be read on use of force. Things like active aggression, passive resistance, what are the differences between those, and how do you as a commander adequately analyze whether a police officer was responding to active aggression or responding to passive resistance. That was one of the criticisms that the Department of Justice raised that we felt was a valid criticism that needed to be addressed. And then the Department of Justice also had concerns with the number of people that had the equipment to respond to crowd control events when they're getting violent. And so one of the things that they had asked was for the city to consider increasing the number of staff who are trained, PPB staff who are trained in responding to crowd control events and have the proper equipment for that. And the equipment, what I'm talking about is not any weapon, but rather like the helmet and some body gear that has a bunch of padding on it. And then I'm going to keep going because I know I don't have a lot of time, and I want to be sure that I touch all the areas. So moving on to training, there were concerns regarding the city's training requirements. Every year the Bureau comes up with training that they'll give to the officers, excuse my dogs, my apologies, to officers each year. And last year, due to COVID and then due to the protests and other issues, the hands-on training was delayed, and then originally delayed to August and then later delayed till this year. So the Department of Justice found us out of compliance based on that lack of training last year, and the city is, or the Bureau is completing that training by the end of May this year. So in the next few weeks, that training from last year, the catch-up will be done, and then this year's training will also occur. Moving on to the next area. Sorry, I'm just scrolling through and making sure that I cover everything. Was community engagement. That was that there's a requirement that the police bureau provide an annual report and report on it to council, and then also hold community meetings in each precinct and present their report and engage with the community around the analysis of the last year. And in 2020, only 2 of the 3 precincts held that community meeting. The intent is for that annual report to be done and all the community meetings to occur by the end of the summer of this year. So that will occur earlier than usual. And then finally, on officer accountability, I broke that down into a couple different sections because the first, I responded first in our letter to the Department of Justice's concerns regarding it that they raised in their annual report. Those were regarding the timeliness of investigations, specifically there was a concern that IPR, the independent police reviews, timelines were not being met during last year. And there was also a concern raised about the transition to the Community Police Oversight Board that is the subject of the charter amendment that passed by the voters last year. And then there was reference to a couple of incidents that were of concern to the Department of Justice. And then beyond that, there were specific police review board meetings that occurred that the Department of Justice had concerns with. As to the timelines, IPR and the auditor's office temporarily reassigned some personnel and moved them into the independent police review to assist with getting IPR back up to speed on getting all the complaints analyzed and investigated. They had a huge influx of complaints last year as a result of all the protests, and they were unable to meet that given their staffing. And so, so the auditor, as I said, moved staff to assist them, and they hope to be back within substantial compliance of most investigations being concluded within 180 days within the next couple months. And then the council is, in regard to the transition to the Community Police Oversight Board, there was concern about IPR's employees and their retaining them. And so council has committed to funding IPR in its present capacity through the transition to the Oversight Board, and also to find some suitable incentives aimed at the IPR employees to hopefully incentivize them to remain on through that transition to the Community Police Oversight Board. As to the officer accountability, there were some discussions around intentional strikes to the head and kind of how that goes, and the Department of Justice and the city have been talking about how that's implemented when you learn of information after an event occurs, that given the facts of the event that you learn later, leads to suggest that the deadly force policy should be applied. So in this instance, there was a baton strike to the head. If it's an intentional strike to the head, then it's a use of deadly force, and it requires a number of things occur, a lot of which have to occur in the moment. And so the city and the Department of Justice have been talking about how do you do that if you learn about the intentionality of the strike after the event occurs. And then lastly was there was a March 23rd letter, and there's a lot of detail in there, and I would ask that you refer to my or the city's response to go through the detail of it. But I think that some of the things that that were concerns from the Department of Justice were things that were important that we address, so one of which, as I discussed earlier, was ensuring that everybody understands what is active aggression versus what is the legal definition of active aggression versus passive resistance and physical resistance. Because under our policy, only active aggression would authorize the use of force. Passive resistance does not allow for a use of force in that instance. So ensuring that everybody really understands that definition well. This was part of the restraining order involved with Judge Hernandez as well. And Judge Hernandez ordered that the city provide training bureau-wide on this issue, and so that's what's occurring. There was concern about the discipline guide and understanding how to apply the discipline guide appropriately. That were valid concerns, and that issue the Bureau is addressing with people who are misunderstanding things to ensure that people apply the right standard when using the discipline guide. There were concerns. There was some misapplication of force policies. So in crowd control events, there's one policy about crowd control events, and then there's still the separate use of force policy. And the use of force policy in crowd control events, you still go to both these directives and both directives apply. And there was some confusion that the crowd control policy somehow was the only one that applied in a crowd control event, and that you didn't still apply the use of force policy. The city agreed with the DOJ that both those policies apply in any use of force that occurs in a crowd control event. And there was a concern that there was an investigator that misunderstood that. That investigator has been, that issue has been clarified for that investigator. And is additionally, this is another area where the Bureau will ensure that when the Bureau-wide training occurs, that everybody is 100% clear that both policies apply. We want to be sure that there's no misunderstanding around that. I think that there were some other areas. There were some other areas that we disagreed on. There was one area where in the letter where the Department of Justice felt that one of the people reviewing matters in the investigation process, that person should have included the satisfactory performance, an allegation that the officer had violated the satisfactory performance directive as well as the use of force directive. And that person disagreed with the Department of Justice on that. Their feeling was that the appropriate directive to apply was the use of force. And so the city suggested there is a process within the settlement agreement. If in a civil case, there's an outcome that's different than what happens in the IA process. And so the city has suggested that we could use that process if there is a feeling that the outcome in that particular case was not correct.
Okay.
Thanks, Anne.
Yeah, just want to check in with you. Are you just about done? We wanted to allow others to. Our process is going to be that we're going to have Jared Hager from the DOJ take some time to respond or give us information from them. We're also going to have a couple other organizations, stakeholders in the settlement agreement speak, and then we're going to open it up for community questions and questions from everyone. So is there any last thing you'd like to add before we move on?
I think the only other thing I want to add, is just to reiterate the city's commitment to the settlement agreement and ensuring that the city gets back into substantial compliance and successfully meets all the requirements under that agreement. And that's really the goal of the council and the city. And thank you. I definitely appreciate any questions people have.
Okay, and we will have those questions at the end. And someone has asked our process for that. Vadim Mazursky is going to be facilitating that, and he'll go over that process at that part of the meeting. So now I'd like to introduce Jared Hager from the U.S. Department of Justice.
Thanks, Anne, and thanks to the committee for having me. I'm here with my colleague, Jonas Geisler from the District of Columbia. He works in the Civil Rights Division in the Special Litigation Section. We don't have much to respond to at this time. We are evaluating the city's response. It's got a lot of words. Within it, there are several admissions of non-compliance. There are a few disputes, and there are a few excuses, and there's a few remedies that are offered. And our task as the Department of Justice, in pursuant to paragraph 181, is to evaluate the city's response to see if it resolves our concerns. And so we're in the mindset of looking at this in terms of the remedies that the city has offered for its admitted non-compliances. There's one, paragraph I do want to underscore, that's paragraph 169 that we found the city not in compliance with. And that requires the police bureau to hold officers accountable for violations of policy. And we heard Heidi talk a lot about, training and as a remedy that's going to happen. But, these policies have existed and they've been trained before. And we see a lot of non-compliances with those policies and trainings over the summer. So we're going to take a close look and evaluate the city's response. And in due course, we will reach out to the city to schedule that meeting. But at this time, we don't have authority and we're not able to speak to any of the specific points that Heidi raised. I do want to be able to reserve, or cede some of our time to the Albina Ministerial Alliance and the Mental Health Alliance that are both here. And, for anyone part of the community, we would like to, invite you to talk to us about remedies and what you think are appropriate remedies for the city's noncompliance. So with that, I'll let Jonas say any remarks that he might want to add. And then we'll be happy to answer questions to the extent we can.
Thank you. I think after Jonas, we'll have someone from the AMA speak and then someone from the Mental Health Alliance, and then we'll go to questions after that, if that's all right.
Thank you, Ann. Thank you, Jared. As Jared said, we have a limited ability to speak. We are assessing right now, and I look forward to a time when we can speak more broadly about the many issues in the city's response. Thank you for having us here. We're pleased to see the time to AMAC and MHA. Thank you, Ann.
Thank you. Okay. Can we have someone from the AMA speak, please?
Hi, everyone. I'm Ashley Albies. I'm counsel for the Albina Ministerial Alliance Coalition for Justice and Police Reform, a community organization that's been granted enhanced amicus status in this case. Dr. Haynes was planning on being here. I don't see him in the screen that's in front of me, but if he is here, he's welcome to interrupt me. Our other steering committee members unfortunately had conflicts tonight, but very much did want to be here. And really I had checked in with Dr. Haynes about attending tonight, and really we wanted to listen to the community response to the Department of Justice, feedback to the city and the city's response. So with Dr. Haynes not being here to say anything else, I'll just take on the role of listening and responding to any specific questions that I can. And I appreciate everybody. I know the AMA appreciates everybody's participation and the hard work of the PCCEP and continues to want to engage with this process and with this case and support PCCEP in their role as community engagement. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Mental Health Alliance, is that Juan Chavez? Are you here to speak on behalf?
Good afternoon. I'm, for anybody who doesn't know, my name is Juan Chavez. I use he, him pronouns, and I represent the Mental Health Alliance in court. Today, we'll have Meredith Mathis speak on behalf of the Alliance. We have several members here tonight, but looking forward to hearing from Meredith.
Hi, I'm Meredith. I'm a member of the Mental Health Alliance. We were just going to talk about a few things that are a little outside of the letter, but still pertaining to this. So we still had some concerns about the PCCEP and just that we had tried to submit some metrics to measure success for the PCCEP and had run into some barriers in that we submitted that and then they had voted not to vote on those metrics. And so we never really established concrete measures of success or how to define, measure, or track the progress of the PCCEP in the past year. And then additionally, in terms of community engagement, we were concerned with the Behavioral Health Unit Advisory Committee for the Portland Police, just in that they still aren't allowing members of the public to attend meetings. They're not publicly posting meeting times, dates, or locations. We think they're failing to comply with the Oregon public meeting laws and more generally are just closing meetings in a way that is antithetical to community engagement. And that's kind of our general concerns.
Can I ask one clarifying question? The group that you said is not following meeting requirements. Can you say what that group is again?
Yeah, it's the Behavioral Health Unit Advisory Committee. So it's supposed to be advising the Portland Police Bureau.
Okay, so it's not associated with PCCEP.
No, that's separate.
Thank you.
Thanks, Meredith. I did have a question about the metrics for PCCEP. When was that presented to PCCEP? What date? Do you have that?
I can pull up the date really.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Okay, I think now Vadim is going to go ahead and facilitate the next part of our meeting. Thank you all.
All right, thank you, Anne, and thank you, Zainab, and all the presenters so far. I'm going to first open up this portion to PCCEP members to ask questions briefly. We know the community has quite a few questions to ask as well. And then after that, I will ask people to use the raise hand function in Zoom, and I'll look at that and see who's raising their hands and call upon them. I also have several questions that were submitted to Theo directly, to one of our PCCEP staff people directly, and I'll read from those as time permits. So first, let me just open it up. Would any of the PCCEP members here have any questions either for the city or for the Department of Justice?
I do.
Yes, Zainab, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you. And it's really for Heidi Brown. I had a chance to read the city's response, and I really got stuck in the introduction pieces. And I think Jared spoke to some of the, I would say, excuses that were presented of why things weren't happening. I had a lot of questions, but something that I was interested of hearing you talk about, but you didn't address, was the federal troops, which was very present in the beginning of the presentation of your report. And it seemed to me that the city was sharing that a lot of the issues were based on the fact that the federal troops were deployed. And so can you speak to that, or can you share when you present this information, what are you looking to get from the Department of Justice?
Thank you for the question. I think that this case is between the United States and the city of Portland. So it's not between the Department of Justice and the Portland Police Bureau or any individual partner. And so when you're looking at that, and the situation that the city found ourselves in last summer, where there were many peaceful protests occurring early on, and then things had quieted down quite a bit to where there were about 150 protesters coming out a night, so much fewer numbers than there had been previously. And when the federal troops came into Portland, it really inflamed the situation, and the numbers shot far back up. There were people injured. There was the mayor of Portland had put first a limitation on the use of CS gas, and then put a very clear limitation to, in only extreme situations could CS gas be used. And yet the federal troops were using CS gas extensively. There is currently a lawsuit with the city of Oakland and the city of Portland against the federal government for their actions during that time. And the concern is just that it inflamed a challenging situation that made it much harder for the city to remain in substantial compliance, because there was so much more volatility going on when the federal troops came to Portland. It is not to say in any way that, as we said in the letter, it is not to excuse the city's conduct and the ways that the city needs to ensure that we are in compliance with the settlement agreement. and ensure officer accountability. That is a critical part, and it is something that we address. We have a whole system for dealing with complaints against officers and ensuring that officers are held accountable if there is an excessive use of force. And so that portion of the letter was solely to say that that there were actions by the federal government that exacerbated things and made things much more challenging for the city than they had been prior to that time.
And I just want to make clear that the non-compliance from the city's part happened far before any federal troops were involved in policing crowd control in Portland. I believe you heard Heidi admit that in June, they fell out of compliance with their force reporting and review. And again, I've made this point before, but it wasn't the demonstrations that overwhelmed the city. It was the police bureau's use of force. And there's no connection between the police bureau using force and federal troops that I've seen.
And thank you. And that was what I was gonna ask. Like my next question was any of the police bureau along with the federal troops at any time during any of the protests? And if so, who took control, who took action? I don't want to go into that, but I feel like when I looked at your report, I looked at also thinking about the history of protests, the history of police, the history of law enforcement, and while I recognize that there may have been an unusual amount of people out, but I also recognize that same year in other countries, there were a lot of protests and massive protests. Did the city or did those internally assess whether or not we should be ready or be prepared in case any of this could happen in the city of Portland or anywhere else across the nation? So I would speak to that. And also, I want to go to the fact that the technology, the Office 365, that kind of spoke to me too, that the city felt that there was not proper technology. And so when was this assessed? And then if so, why didn't that get addressed prior or, during or, and then the last piece was, I didn't understand the piece about comparing the excessive use of force and policies to the hospitals not having ventilators. That troubled me a lot. And while I understood that that was a response based on what was going on, it just troubled me that the city or those who are part of the city would compare what was happening with excessive force to those who didn't have ventilators. And so can you speak on why that was added? Thank you.
Yes, so I'm going to go in reverse order, and please let me know if I miss something. So in answer to your question about the hospitals, the call to the Department of Justice in June was about the timing of the after action reports. So when a use of force event, so when an officer uses force, they're required to write a report. It's called an FDCR for those of you who don't know, a force data report. And so early on, the Bureau contacted Department of Justice and said, we are not getting those after action reviews of those use of force reports. They're supposed to happen within 72 hours. They're not happening within 72 hours. And the point was that for any organization, you are going to staff up to what your normal business is. And the city is the same way. The city can't afford, nor would I think the community want the city to have, tons of police officers, tons of sergeants, just in case there are protest events that some of which end up getting violent and having fires lit and things of that nature that get dangerous. I don't think anybody would want the city to staff up at that level. The point was just that hospitals, the city, nationwide, everybody was staffed up for what is a normal year like, not what is a pandemic year like. And that nor was it a year where the murder of George Floyd, created an event where people finally took to the streets in huge numbers, nationwide and internationally, as you said. And I think that there wasn't an expectation that protests would go on as long as they went on. There wasn't, to my knowledge, there wasn't anywhere else in the nation where protests went on as long as they did in the city of Portland. So my analogy, the analogy to the hospitals was simply to say that to expect substantial compliance, to expect those reports to be done within 72 hours when you're in an unprecedented circumstance, that was an unrealistic expectation. I'm sorry, but I know your first question and I don't remember your second one. I'm going to jump to your first question. And then if you don't mind reminding me your second one, I will come back to that. You asked about the city not being ready. I think I may have kind of answered that. You said, why wasn't the city ready for nationwide protests? And I think that the city of Portland is, staffs up for protests that occur. And there's been a number of trainings in the police bureau and a number of changes to how the police bureau works with crowds. And I think you saw that over the last couple years with some of the responses to some of the protests to ensure that there weren't clashes between police and community members. But I don't think anybody was anticipating the protests to go on as long as they did. And that's what people weren't prepared for. And then you had a second question, and I apologize.
Yeah, thank you, Heidi. And I'm not going to take everyone else's time, but the unrealistic expectations for the police bureau or the city to be able to provide after action reports in a timely manner, you didn't feel that was the case because of what was going on. And I just want to ask, was there any communications between the city and the Department of Justice or the community about how they were going to meet their expectations, if they were going to meet their expectations, and then how soon did the city meet their expectations during this process? So if it wasn't 72 hours or the 3 days, how much time? And then the question was about the Office 365, the technology that said that because it didn't exist or you don't have it, it made it harder for the supervisors to review.
Got it. Yes. As you were speaking, I was like, oh yes, Office 365. So for Office 365, the city changed over to Office 365 about 5 years ago, and it went citywide except for the police bureau. And the police bureau couldn't go to Office 365 because it wasn't compliant with CJIS, the Criminal Justice Information System. And there's federal and state laws that require the way that you're nodding your head, so it looks like you know what I'm talking about. So federal and state laws that require how a police bureau handles criminal justice information, and Office 365 wasn't previously set up to confidentially handle that information. It wasn't secure enough. It is now, and that's why the change now, but it will allow for people to access things more quickly, things are time-stamped so you can better track what's going on. Some of the other changes that have occurred are that there's a sergeant assigned to do the after actions at the end of the night, and the officers who are involved in protest events that end up with any use of force events, that there's discussions happening that same night, both with the officer and any witness officers and any other witnesses if there are some still available. You said something about unrealistic expectations, and I apologize again because I don't recall. I got so lost in Office 365.
No, it's fine. You just were responding to the question, and you said about there was unrealistic expectations to get the after action reports in a timely manner because of what was happening with the long-term protest unrest. And I was just wondering, like, was it communicated? Did you say, okay, but we're not going to get it done in 3 days, but we'll get it done in maybe 12 days? Like, was there any type of correction to not being able to meet that in compliance? Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, there was. So pretty early on, there was a communication with Department of Justice saying the sheer volume were not meeting the timelines. And then there was a reassignment of sergeants to, because there weren't enough sergeants available to review the after action reports, or excuse me, the force reports. So there was a reassignment of a number of sergeants to review those force reports. That, of course, was part of the reason that we were out of compliance, though, because those sergeants were then reviewing it after the fact. And DOJ rightly pointed out that's not quite the critical analysis that they were looking for. But there was a response to that, but at the same time, there were a number of people leaving the Bureau, and so the numbers in the Bureau were decreasing, so there were fewer people available.
Zainab, I'd like to add to that answer, if you don't mind.
No problem, Heidi.
Thank you. In early June, we began asking for data regarding the crowd control events. Only after a while did Portland admit that they were behind, and we said we could not amend the settlement agreement by ourselves. It would have to be a court order. And Portland told us that they were still delayed. We said we would have to assess the reasonableness. After some period of time, we were presented with a fait accompli that Portland decided to skip June 2020 for all of its after action reviews and do those down the road. We quote on page 10 of our compliance report, a letter from then City Attorney Tracy Reeve, dated September 25th, 2020, in which she says, even at that point in time, the city had not caught up. Your question, Zainab, was when did they catch up? Last night, the force inspector presented to the Training Advisory Council and said, as of last night, they still had not caught up with the audit of Q4 of 2020 and still have no date for the assessment of crowd control uses of force for their audit, which is a separate audit in addition to the 4 quarters of 2020. They're not caught up. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, Heidi. Thank you, Jonas. I appreciate that. Back to you, Vadim and Ann.
Okay, I have a question, and then we'll call on Amy Anderson and Ann Campbell in the order that they raised their hands, I believe. My question is for Jared, really, at this point. Heidi touched upon this a little bit with respect to the transition to the new police oversight board. Currently, the auditor's office has the independent police review, and within that is the CRC that hears complaints against the police bureau. The voters overwhelmingly voted for a new oversight board to be established, and now we're in May, and I understand that there's a commission that will be formed to create the new board, and that commission has not even been convened yet. So it's taking quite some time with quite a bit of uncertainty on IPR's part and the CRC's part. So for Jared, how does this uncertainty play into the compliance issues, and especially if the people start leaving within the CRC, within IPR, and they start falling behind with respect to the investigations? Thank you.
It's a great question, and I'll do my best to answer it, but I think it's a better question put to Madam Auditor, who's here. They'll understand better how the uncertainty impacts their compliance with their obligations under the settlement agreement. I do want to editorialize, we've pointed out several fundamental problems with the City of Portland's accountability and the implementation of the accountability and enforcing the policy and training that they've already done. I half expected that a transition to the new oversight board would have been part of their remedies, but it wasn't mentioned in the letter. So with that, how it impacts IPR, I think that's a better question for the director of IPR and the auditor.
Okay, well, let me ask them then. We do have on the line, as I mentioned, Ross Caldwell, director of IPR, as well as Mary Hall Caballero, the auditor. Would either of y'all like to provide any kind of input on what Jared has just said?
Yeah, I can try to answer that. I think Mary, the auditor, can answer other parts. She just got kicked out of Zoom. She just texted me, so unfortunate timing there, but she should be back in a few minutes, hopefully. So we might just have to catch her up. We've been trying to get a plan from the city on a transition from IPR to the new accountability system for about half the time that I've worked at IPR, so about 8 or 9 months. It's been kind of the big thing that we've been trying to do, and we still don't have a plan in place. There's been a lot of talk of incentives, but this is I don't think there's any good time to take your eye off the ball as far as police accountability is concerned, but this is an especially terrible time to do that. And so what we really need is a plan that keeps our folks at IPR working, which would include the need to hire. It sounds like the transition is going to take 3 years or maybe longer. And so, in any office, there's going to be people that leave during a long time like that. So we need some kind of a plan that allows us to rehire people if they leave. And I think that in order to have that, we need a plan that says, this is what kind of work you're going to be doing. This is where you'll be working. And we have not, as of yet, seen that from the city. I know there was a budget note that was passed by city council just an hour or so ago, but I don't think that really addresses this in the way that we need it addressed. So I think there's a couple of different things that need to happen. I think, Mary as the auditor needs to be able to feel like she can rehire people and that she can continue to manage IPR until as you said, overwhelmingly supported new accountability system can get off the ground and can be up and running, and we can hand things off to them. And then individual employees at IPR need to know that they're going to have work that they feel like is meaningful, or else I think they'll just go work someplace else. And we could be in a situation where, I feel like as a manager at IPR, I'm very concerned about being able to hire new folks that will have the expertise we need to perform administrative investigations the way we need them done. So we're not there yet. I'm not sure, the approved budget came through today, so I don't know if we're not there yet exactly how we're going to get there. So I think it continues to be an area of much concern. And if Mary was able to jump back in yet, she might have something else to say.
Thank you, Ross. I'll keep an eye out for that. Amy, you've had your hand up for quite a while. Would you have a question?
Yeah,
Heidi,
no.
can I just clarify? Oh, sorry.
Oh, yes. Was that Heidi? I'm sorry.
Yeah, I just wanted to note that the council vote today was not approving the budget. That doesn't happen until June. Thanks.
Okay. All right. Amy?
Yeah, mine wasn't really a question. It was more of, I wanted the folks in the room to know that PCCEP spent months reviewing the metrics that everyone talked about, that Meredith talked about, and Jason and Patrick. And basically, if I'm not mistaken, a lot of the material in the document was written pre-COVID. So we went through each and every line item trying to, figure out how we can meet the requirements during the COVID. And so we went to Zoom. So a lot of the requirements or requests that were made, we either did complete or we had to switch gears because of COVID restrictions on meeting and developing relationships. None of that was possible anymore. So I did want the room to know that we spent extensive months reviewing those documents, trying to find items that we could move forward on that fit within the safety protocols of this now COVID situation. So I just wanted everyone to know the metrics were reviewed, analyzed, and checked off for the ones we've completed, and the ones we haven't, we're working really hard on bridging communication links with everybody who's available and whoever wishes to come to Zoom. So I just wanted everyone to know we have reviewed them and we're working continuously on trying to meet the goals. So I just want to put that out there. I spent a lot of time reviewing them in order to ascertain which ones we could safely do during COVID restrictions. So I just want to put that out there. Thank you all for doing it. It was received and we are continually reviewing it.
All right. Thank you, Amy. Anne, would you have a question?
Yes, I just wanted to quickly follow up on something Jonas said. We at PCCEP have talked about this issue before. The month of June, where no after action reports were reviewed, and Jonas said that still waiting on information. I'm worried in part by that and other things that I've heard about accountability and responsibility. Those continue to be very concerning to me from the city. And I'm not really hearing how we're moving forward on that. So it's more of just a comment. And I want to make sure we have time for other community members to comment.
Vadim, are you going to call on other community members? Are we finished with other PCEPs?
Thank you. Thank you. I did see that the auditor has just come on board. So the auditor, Mary Hall Caballero is back. And auditor, we had Ross provide a synopsis of where things are with the IPR and compliance with the settlement agreement. Since we often ask the elected officials to speak in the beginning, I just did want to give you some space in case you had any comments to make about the auditor's office with respect to the settlement agreement.
Thank you, Vadim. I appreciate it. I'm sorry I had some technical difficulties there. I understand that council voted today on a budget note that was part of the approved budget. And I was hoping for a strong signal from council that they would support the employees of Independent Police Review, that they would allow me to be able to manage during the transition. And the only way I can keep IPR together is if the employees are incentivized to stay in their jobs until we can get through the transition to the new board. And for me to be able to do that, I have to hold that division together. And if any of the employees leave, I need to be able to replace them. And I put in a couple of proposals to council, and they were not received. And what happened today is that certain parts of what I proposed were cherry picked out, and the part that I needed to be in place, which was to retain the employees and for me to be able to replace them, were not as strongly stated as they needed to be for that to happen. And so unfortunately, I do not have a lot of confidence that what the council approved today is going to be very successful. And I hope that it works, but I don't have a lot of confidence that it will. And so I am gravely concerned about the city of Portland being able to deliver independent police investigations until the new board is ready. And I am disappointed that it did not go better today at council.
Thank you, Auditor. Certainly that's an integral piece of the settlement agreement as well as the police oversight. So hopefully that can be rectified. I'm going to now reach out to individuals that have had their hands up and have messaged me about asking questions. First, I'd like to ask Casey Lewis from Disability Rights Oregon if he has any questions for the presenters today.
My question is for the city, and just to make sure, I am Casey Lewis. I'm the managing attorney for the Mental Health Rights Project at Disability Rights Oregon. I am also a member of the Mental Health Alliance, although today I am appearing and speaking just in my capacity as a citizen of Portland. So when I was listening to the city's testimony, I was really struck by the number of times, and this reflects what I read in the city's response to DOJ, that words like misunderstood, misidentified, misapprehended were used. And it seems to really be the city's contention that all of the issues with the system of holding police accountable and looking at acts of violence by the police are just sort of a big misunderstanding, that there is sort of a systemic failure within both the police bureau and the organizations that have been designed to hold the police bureau accountable, including the police bureau leadership, including, unfortunately, it sounds like the IPR investigators, to really understand the guidelines around use of force. And interestingly enough, it seems like those misunderstandings within the bureau, within the IPR, within the city in general, all seem to err on the side of allowing and condoning more use of force, of basically opening up the use of force to things that are beyond what policy permits, beyond what the Constitution permits. There seems to be really a leaning towards that side of things. So my question for the city really is, if the city is not going to acknowledge this as a systemic problem, a problem where this is a system that seems to be gravitating towards using more force towards approving more force and towards refusing to hold itself accountable for more force, how can we really take seriously the city's contention that this is important to it? Because I have heard and read nothing but excuses from the city in terms of characterizing this entirely in terms of a police force that doesn't understand when it should be using force, when, as we have heard from DOJ today, they've received these trainings before. This is not new. And the city's unwillingness to look at the possibility that maybe they do understand the policy, maybe they just don't care. I want to know how is the city addressing that possibility rather than just seeing this as sort of a series of accidents?
Thank you for the question. I will say that there are plenty of complaints against officers for uses of force that were alleged to be excessive that are going through the system now, and some that have gone through the process. There was a request earlier from the PCCEP to know how many officers have been sustained on a use of force violation, and we are looking into what information we can provide, and we'll let them know at that time. But there are absolutely use of force cases that are going through. And as for your concerns about the systemic issues, I think that, there's a number of things that City Council is doing. For example, I think that one of the ways that Portland City Council is looking at changing systemic issues is Portland Street Response. And there was a vote today on expanding Portland Street Response, so that there's more money there, and there will be.
That vote failed, by the way. I just wanted to give that update. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Oh, no, that's okay. I guess I thought I'd heard it passed. So then that was going to increase the budget. I think the budget currently is 4.8 million. It was going to increase it by another $1 million. So I know there's still a plan to expand that program. It may not expand as much as folks had hoped it would by that $1 million, which is obviously a significant amount of money. But definitely there's a plan to expand Portland Street Response and to get more people responding in a different way to force. I think also there's the Community Oversight Board, another item that that was sent to the voters. I know DOJ has expressed some concerns about that oversight board and the process that the city went through, and in sending in a charter amendment to the voters. And now the city is looking at, okay, how do we go through and set up the Community Oversight Board, and what is it going to look like? And then if we are still with the Department of Justice, then obviously we will need to amend the settlement agreement in order to allow that oversight board to stand up, and they will be, the Department of Justice will have some say on whether or not that board meets their requirements for accountability. So hopefully that will work out in a positive way. But I guess I wanted to say that I think that I think the city does recognize systemic issues. I think the mayor's concern with the use of CS gas was another example of city council looking at the way that police were interacting with the community that was coming out to protest, and concerns raised around the use of CS gas. And that's when he put the ban in effect that caused actually there weren't any other uses of CS gas during protest events thereafter. I will note that the Department of Justice was very concerned about that. The mayor's announcement of the ban, we had a meeting with them to discuss it. As you know, in Seattle, the Department of Justice took the Seattle City Council to court, and when the when the Seattle City Council tried to ban CDS gas, the Department of Justice got a stay on that, and they weren't allowed to ban it. So I think that the city council absolutely recognizes systemic issues, and that they are working to find ways to change the way that policing occurs, and to ensure that those really are systemic changes. The other piece I would talk about is, I know the new equity manager at the Police Bureau, Marlon Marion, has rolled out his new equity training that is going bureau-wide, and I think it's another important piece of it, recognizing that training won't change people's minds, but I think it's important. It's still an important piece of ensuring that people are learning about the impacts of systemic racism, of the history of white supremacy in this country, and how that has historically and currently impacts people. So I really do think that the city is looking at ways to address the systemic issues.
Nadeem, a quick response if you don't mind.
I just want to say, I just doing a time check as well. It's 6:16, so we'll be ending the meeting at 6:30.
If it's all right with everybody, I do want to maybe extend it for a little bit. So will anybody that needs to disconnect at 6:30, but I think it's very important to catch as many people as possible. So my apologies for running a little bit late, but Jonas, would you have a comment to add to that?
Very quickly, I greatly respect Heidi, but lest the city's council speak for DOJ, I want to say that DOJ's concern is not a concern of the concept of a community board. Rather, what is the plan? That has been our concern from the beginning. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jonas. Next, we have Debbie and then Zakir Khan. Debbie Iona with League of Women's Voters. Would you have any questions?
Yeah, I had a question about the annual report, or actually two questions. Number one, how is the Police Bureau going to let people know that the meetings in the precincts are taking place? I know the last couple of years, it's been difficult, if not impossible, to find out when the few meetings that did occur were actually scheduled. And then my second question is, my sense of the reason for this requirement in the settlement agreement is to promote kind of a conversation between the Police Bureau and the community. And I'm wondering, in the interest of that spirit, if the mayor is considering setting aside his usual prohibition on oral testimony at reports during city council sessions, if he's thinking about setting that aside so the public can actually give oral testimony on the annual report. Thank you.
Debbie, I don't know the answer to your question about what the mayor intends to do during the presentation of the annual report. So I can't answer that question. But I do know that the Bureau for the community meetings is certainly considering how to ensure that there is greater accessibility. So one thing they're looking at is, could the community meeting for the annual report at the precincts, could they be held by Zoom? I think that not only addresses accessibility concerns regarding COVID, but also if there are folks who, I've certainly heard community members who have raised concerns about going into precincts and their own experiences and sort of the re-traumatization that occurs in going into police precincts. So while the settlement agreement requires that they occur at the precincts, one idea is to hold those meetings virtually, which would allow might allow for greater participation. And as far as the announcements of when they're going to happen, I don't have the answer for that, but hopefully the Bureau can provide the information to the PCCEP meeting and others to get the word out so that as many folks in the community as possible can attend.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, Debbie, and thank you for all the work, Debbie, that you've been doing in this arena, both with the PCCEP and the CRC. Next question from Zakir Khan. Mr. Khan.
Thank you. This is a two-parter. My name is Zakir Khan, just for the record. If the city of Portland knew back in 2014 through the DOJ settlement agreement that use of force was a problem, why did they not invest in infrastructure back then? Why did they never invest in actual use of force software that other states have actually adopted and wholeheartedly, like the state of New Jersey? So that's kind of the first part of the question, because what I've just seen happen over time is that the city of Portland has just literally waited for the problem to get persistently worse and be highly reactive and mitigate things that, like when the DOJ is pushing that you need to report use of force and you need to properly document it, it's just mitigation rather than accepting the actual problem and then fixing the actual problem. And 7 years later, we're still waiting for adequate infrastructure. And I was really alarmed that the proposed solution is getting Office rather than getting actual use of force software that is available from a variety of different vendors. So that's the first part of the question. Why did the city not originally invest in use of force infrastructure? And the second question is, underneath House Bill 4205, which was passed in the first special session, the Portland Police Bureau has a duty, individual officers have a duty to report misconduct to their superiors. So I'm wondering critically, one, how many officers have actually utilized that law? And two, has DOJ done any oversight of the utilization of that law? Thank you.
And your first question, why hasn't the city invested in software in 2014? I apologize, but I cannot answer that question. I just started working on the DOJ matters shortly before our prior city attorney, Tracy Reeve, retired, and she retired in December. So I started working with the DOJ probably late summer. And I don't know that level of detail of the history, and I apologize that I don't. As to I don't know, and I don't know, why wasn't the use of force infrastructure considered now rather than Office 365? I don't know that answer either, but I can say that just with the current budget situation, it may be that Office 365 was something that the city could set up relatively quickly and get it implemented, because there's concern if there are a greater number of protests this summer and leading into the fall, that it'll be challenging with the current infrastructure to ensure that all the after action reports are happening timely and make sure that things aren't that things are occurring within that 72-hour period. So, so without being able to really answer your questions, and I'm sorry about that, that's the best I can say on that. Regarding House Bill 4205, which requires officers to both intervene if they're observing what they reasonably believe could be excessive use of force, and to report if they observe an excessive use of force or learn about it. I don't have the answer to how many officers have made reports under that provision. I don't know that they would have done it under that provision. The Bureau had a policy that predated that law that required officers to report if they observed an excessive use of force.
Okay, thank you. And Mr. Khan, did that answer your question, or do you have any follow-ups? We have a little bit of time if you do have any follow-ups.
Yeah, just to follow up to DOJ, if they've done any examination of if the Bureau is complying with that law and if they've seen any kind of reporting in that vein.
The current FTCR form that we've reviewed doesn't have a separate checkbox for that. There's a requirement for reporting of misconduct. So if one observes misconduct, one must report that. The Bureau separately also pledged to participate in the ABLE program, that is active bystandership for law enforcement. It is a policy and training 10-point program that is championed by Georgetown University and one of the former deputy chiefs from our section, Christy Lopez, with whom I've worked on other matters. That program is very successful. It's based upon the EPIC model in New Orleans from a Loyola professor down there. We said in our compliance report on page 20 of 73 that the Bureau announced its intention to participate in the ABLE program, but essentially it has not evidence that it's done the other steps necessary. So it has not, for example, revised its training plan to have anything but a mention that it will do ABLE. no statement of a calendar for training or how it will do the training or a internal champion for the ABLE program. In a roundabout way, Zakir, and I'm sorry to spend so long talking about this for your answer to your question. No, we have not seen a narrative in an FDCR that cites the specific code from the state on the duty to intervene. Yes, we approved policies that required prior to the state law that there was a duty to intervene and a duty to report. And yes, we've encouraged the city to participate in the ABLE program for a long time, and the city finally responded. And we encourage the city to revise its training plan to address the ABLE program. We have not seen a revised training plan, and nor do we believe that the Training Advisory Council has either. Thank you.
Thank you. That answers my question.
Okay, I have one more hand raised. There are a couple of questions I have that were submitted ahead of time. Both those questions have been answered in part. So I will read them if we have time, but in the meantime, Zainab, did you have something to add?
I just want to follow up because that question about training, back to Heidi, because that's one of the things that I was thinking about too when Zahir mentioned the fact that did they implement training to cover police officers who do see excessive force? Is that part of the training today? And I noticed that you said training is going to roll out starting June. Will it be part of the training going forward?
So the current PPB policies already required officers to report if they saw an excessive use of force. So they have been trained on that, and they will continue to receive training on that requirement under the law, but also predating it under the policy.
Okay, and I see Casey Lewis has his hand up, and then Ann Campbell. Mr. Lewis, would you have a follow-up question there?
Yes, I promise it's a quick one. And sorry to put you on the spot for kind of answering for PPB, Heidi. You're the only city person we have here, so apologize for that and really appreciate your answer to my last question. This one is sort of to the city and the DOJ. So there was an after action report issued by the PPB with regard to the protests that blamed the protests on younger people lacking entertainment and work, made no mention of Black Lives Matter, and basically exonerated the behavior of the PPB throughout the protests. My question is, does that reflect the city's stance as well? If not, what is sort of the process by which those things get reconciled? And then to DOJ, how do we sort of, how do we deal with kind of the competing things with the city on the one hand saying, we recognize X, Y, and Z as problems and we will address them, and the police bureau on the other hand saying, we do not recognize that we have had any problems with this?
So for my part, Casey, the master after action that talked about events, my understanding of that is that it's to look at operational issues. They are not part of the internal affairs process, and they're kept separate from that because the IA process should be, you don't want it interfered with by the same group that's out engaging in the protests or that's overseeing that. So the commander that wrote the after action report was the main incident commander during the protests. So that person would not be aware of internal affairs, the actions of IPR, and that whole process of holding officers accountable for misconduct. So it's a separate process. I would say that absolutely the city acknowledges that there were a number of things that didn't go well last summer. I'm sure you've heard many council members talk about their concerns about what happened last summer. And in our response, we're absolutely acknowledging there were many things that happened last summer that didn't go well. And and we're looking at ways that we can fix those. And some of those, I think, are bigger systemic issues that you know, that need to be addressed at a different level. And so part of those responses are Portland Street Response, are the new Community Oversight Board. I know there were, you know, public sports safety specialists that were onboarded in another attempt to find ways to have folks interact with community members who aren't police and don't provide that same interaction that can get more volatile, or that people can even just react to because they have a negative history with police. So absolutely, there are a number of ways that the city feels it's important that there needs to be change, and there's a number of things that we've committed to in our letter, and also that we're doing outside of our letter.
Thanks for the question, Casey. I do want to, you know, at least for the record, note that the Department of Justice disagrees with that characterization of an incident commander's role and a after actions role. It's in policy, it's supposed to look at policy violations and compliance with policy. 63510 in the incident commander's role specifically calls out ensuring compliance with 1010 and 900, which is the reporting and the reviewing requirements. And the fact that those were not addressed at all was very disappointing. We delivered a 8-page letter to the city with our criticisms of that master after action report, and it is not satisfactory from our perspective. To answer your second question, you know, the city is the defendant in this case, and so it's the city's obligation to comply with the agreement. The city theoretically has control over the police bureau. And so when the city says it's going to do something, it's on the city to make sure it happens. To the extent the police bureau doesn't comply, then the city doesn't comply. And in that case, we are left to our devices given to us in the settlement agreement to issue a notice of noncompliance, which has happened, to hear the city's response, which has happened, and now we evaluate it. And if we don't see our concerns being resolved, then we move to mediation. And if mediation can't resolve those concerns, there's only one entity that can really order the city to do anything, and that is the court. And so that's the final step in that process. But to be clear, it is the city's obligation to comply with the requirements of the settlement agreement.
Thank you, Heidi. Thank you, Jared. Anne, did you have a question?
Yeah, just one last question for Heidi. And thank you all for being here tonight. Heidi, one thing I didn't hear, I heard that you know, training is going to roll out for the PPB officers starting in June. Are you including ABLE training in that training program? And if you don't know the answer, I know that it doesn't appear we have anyone from the Police Bureau here this evening. Who can we ask about that? Because I've heard the questions, which have been wonderful from members of our community, but I haven't heard a lot of specifics about how things are going to change, and it worries me. Thank you.
I know that the instructors to provide training for the ABLE training have gone through that training, and I know there is a plan to provide the ABLE training, and I just don't have the details of that, and the Bureau would have that. Mary Claire Buckley is on vacation this week, and but if you want to contact her after she gets back, she might be able to answer that question. The training in June is the crowd control training. And again, I'm sorry, the Bureau has the specifics on what's in that training. And I believe that Mary Claire recently sent the lesson plans and the materials to the Department of Justice and the COCL for their review of that training, for them to give feedback on any concerns they might have with either the materials or the lesson plans. So that training in June is specific to crowd control. It is also part of what Judge Hernandez required under his order relating to the temporary restraining order, was that there be bureau-wide training on crowd control and ensuring that people understood, you know, what I was talking about earlier with the definition of active aggression, passive resistance, when you can use one thing versus another, how to engage with people, and so forth. So I'm sorry to have to defer to the Bureau, and I'm sorry that somebody couldn't be here from the Bureau tonight, but they should be able to answer those questions as far as when the hope is for the ABLE training to actually roll out.
Trudy in the chat pointed out that we do have someone labeled M. Buckley on the phone. So if it is Mary Claire Buckley, and if she would like to speak up, we will certainly give space for that. Either feel free to unmute or contact us.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome aboard United Airlines Flight 389 with you on our way up to Portland. But the ABLE training will be separate. It will start hopefully mid to end of August. Portland right now, it is
Mary Claire,
Mary Claire, we can't hear you at all. The captain speaking.
current temperatures 75 degrees. We'll give you an update as to our arrival time and the weather we get.
There's commitment for you.
We'll give Mary Claire a pass on this one.
Yeah, okay.
All right. Well, so let me just say this. If we'll submit all the questions.
Or personal device entertainment.
Are you guys there?
Available on this flight today.
We are, Mary Claire, but we hear the
United app
background from your flight right now more than you, honestly. Okay. So we will ask for the Police Bureau to review this video. It'll be posted online and provide any feedback that they can, and we'll make that available to the public as well. Unfortunately, we just have someone that is apparently in the middle of a flight. So let me still open it up a little bit. I know we're running a little bit past time. If anybody has any additional questions, please raise your hand. In the meantime, there are a couple of questions that were submitted online that have not been asked yet. These have been answered to some extent. So if the respective parties agree that there's no further answer, feel free to say that. But the first question that has been submitted is, please ask the city to provide more specifics about the transition between independent police review and the new police oversight board. Heidi, I know you've spoken this at some extent, but would you like to provide any specifics more than said?
Well, I think that that is part of what council is trying to determine is how that's going to happen. There is a commission that's getting formed now. It'll go to council hopefully in the next month, that has the appointment of the commission members, and then also has kind of a direction for what the commission will do. And then they'll spend the next 18 months looking at what should the oversight board, what should it look like? What is the scope of their investigation? What are their authorities that may exist outside of what was in the charter amendment? And so that board will meet, or excuse me, that commission will meet for 18 months, and then they will bring recommendations back to city council for code changes that would then implement the new board. At that point, then it would be clearer as far as what does the board structure look like, how many directors, who's on the board, how many members of the board, and then the investigative staff and how many investigative staff are necessary. And once that's determined, then we'll go through the process of hiring those people that would be on the board and those people that would be the investigative staff, and whatever other process, because it's not put together yet. I don't know exactly what it's going to look like. But and then that board, part of what they will, or that commission, part of what they will look at is how does that transition from IPR to the new board? How does that occur? Because does IPR finish up the cases that they're working on? What does that look like? That's part of what that commission will look at.
Okay, and so the board, as I recall, or the commission is an 18-month commission, plus the hiring, plus the transition. Are we looking at maybe 3 years at this point, Heidi, do you think?
I think that I've heard 2 to 3 years, and it probably partly depends on how complex does the system look and how many people need to be hired, and then how long does that process take to actually hire folks. And then, of course, if the city is still in the settlement agreement with the Department of Justice, then we will need to work with the Department of Justice as well.
To release in case of unexpected service.
There's Mary Claire again on her flight. So then we'll need to work with the Department of Justice to actually implement that board.
Funny is equipped with board.
We would need their approval under the settlement agreement terms.
Okay, thank you. And I am curious whether we can have an end to the settlement agreement if the transition has not occurred. So we might be having this conversation at a later point in time or with Judge Simon. And then the last question I have, seeing no other hands, and again, this has been discussed a little bit, but why wouldn't Portland Street response be included in this report in a meaningful way? And Heidi, you mentioned this, so let me shoot that over to Jared. Is there any reason to have Portland Street response in the compliance report?
Portland Street response is mentioned in 5 spots of the compliance report. So I'm not sure who asked that question, but if they want to talk to me about where Portland Street response is mentioned in the compliance report, be happy to do it. Off the top of my mind, I believe it's paragraph 90. Portland Street response is part of an effort to triage calls away from a police response. The city is required to do that, and street response is compliant with that obligation. They had complied with that obligation already. This is more compliance, and that's a good thing, because BOEC 911 is obliged to divert calls to the Multnomah County Crisis Line or divert calls to a non-police response where possible. So I know at least in paragraph 90, I want to say in paragraph 113, which talks about the city's obligation to implement crisis triage. Portland Street response is another great aspect of that. And so we have applauded the city's efforts to increase non-police response to people experiencing a mental health crisis or perceived to be in such crisis when it's safe to do so. And happy to answer more questions specifically if someone wants to talk about that.
Okay, and if anybody is here who supplied that question online, please feel free to raise your hand. And then in chat, there was a question: is it assumed that IPR staff would not be considered to be the investigative staff for the new oversight board? And Heidi responded, it is not assumed that IPR staff would not be considered as part of the investigative staff. There's no assumption as to this, and all people are welcome to apply. A little bit of a double negative there, but as I understand it, there's no direct transition from IPR to the oversight board, and it seems people could apply, but I'm not sure what the result of that would be. Well, thank you, everybody. That looks like we have all the questions right now. As everyone here is aware, this is of vital importance to the city, to PPB, as well as most importantly to our community. They've been looking for oversight. They've said this time and time again, that there needs to be better oversight of the police bureau. There's going to be an oversight board in 2 to 3 years that can help with that. But for the time being, it's up to the Justice Bureau, Department of Justice, as well as the city to reconcile some of these issues. And certainly PCCEP will be following this along, whether it goes to mediation or to Judge Simon in federal court to reconcile these issues. And we'll certainly keep everyone apprised. It was a pleasure speaking with everybody here. Thank you all for your time and patience. And if you have any questions following up, everyone's email here is from PCCEP, at least online. So feel free to email myself or Ann or Zainab or Theo, who is our liaison with the city, and we will get back to you. Ann or Zainab, would you like to say anything before we conclude this meeting?
Thank you all for joining us tonight.
Thank you, and we appreciate you being here. Our next meeting date is June 10th, 2021, from 5 p.m. to 6:30 p.m. And hopefully all the information that we will have together, like you said, it will be posted on the internet, the video, the recording of the video, and any other questions or feedback from both the DOJ and also the city.
All right. Have a good night, everybody.
The general meeting is Tuesday, the 25th at 5 p.m. if anybody's interested. General PCCEP meeting. 25th, 5 p.m.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.
Thanks, Zainab. Wonderfully done.
Thanks, Zainab. Good meeting.
Yes, this is good. Thank you. Oh, hi, Judith.
Hey, nice to see you. How you doing?
It was so many people and I couldn't tell and the light was in my eyes, but I'm doing well. How about yourself?
I'm okay.